Our next astronaut is Mark Pilkington. I discovered Mark's stuff through an extraordinary book of his called Mirage Men. Mark is one of those nondescripts, I suppose. He's a writer, publisher, creator, musician, folklorist, traveller, many number of things. And Mirage Men is really the chronicles of a journey he took through the badlands and backwaters of America, where he explored the long history of UFOs and its origins in the murky worlds of espionage and psychological warfare. He went out there and talked to ex-CIA agents and whistleblowers and all these sorts of people. And what he discovered that instead of kind of covering up stories of crashed spacecraft, alien contacts, and secret underground bases, that actually the intelligence agency had a kind of a prime role in actually celebrating, I suppose. But I thought, we thought it'd be great to get him in because there is the folklore of technology, I suppose. The mystery of technology was something that certainly Kate and I were really interested in, and the way that becomes embedded in thoughts about UFOs and what's out there, but also black technologies and covert military operations and secret sites and things like that was a real interest for us and for Mark. Fascinating to hear his discussion. I'll punch you in there.
Thanks, Liam and Kate, and thanks, Joel, for listening. I like the phrase that you brought up from David Bohm of the study of distractions, and I think that's kind of a useful context for this talk. So yeah, Mirage Men is really a cultural history of this idea that we've been visited by benevolent or malevolent extraterrestrials, but it's written in the style of a conspiracy thriller, and is really about the Cold War and Cold War technological one-upmanship and saber-rattling, and the way that the popular imagination, specifically beliefs about UFOs and ET visitations, have been exploited primarily by the American military and intelligence agencies, and to an extent to which I haven't been able to divulge, I'm sure, the Soviet agencies as well, but I've tried to steer this part of the talk into more Soviet-related material, seeing as you lucky buggers are off to Buchananock. But the people who are doing this kind of exploitation of the imagination, this abuse of enchantment, I call the Mirage Men. And actually I first met Liam as part of a camouflage research project that he was involved in, so I saw this as part of a wider camouflage operation, and the camouflage is the camouflage within ideas, really. If we're looking at Baikonur, is Baikonur correct? Baikonur was first designated as a scientific test range in 1955 at the height of the Cold War and the UFO era, and was first discovered and photographed by the Americans in 1957 by the U-2, just months before the launch of Sputnik. So that really kind of collapses everything into what I'll be talking about. And I really see the UFO story as running neatly in parallel to the history of early military technology, and is really a kind of hazy, distorted reflection of that history. And I should just state for the record, I'm absolutely convinced there's not a single story that's emerged from the UFO lore that reflects any kind of genuine interaction between humans and extraterrestrial civilizations. However, like the great biochemist Christian de Derbe, I believe that life is a cosmic imperative, and I'm sure it's out there in some form, even if it is just proteins, amino acids drifting in space. That unfortunately is a doctored image. So the story really begins in June 1947, just in the year that Chuck Yeager flew faster than sound, that ENIAC, the world's first digital computer, was turned on, the year that the transistor was discovered, the microwave oven, the stereoscopic camera, and the AK-47 were all developed. So the year that the US Air Force was established as a separate military service, and the year that the Office of Strategic Services was transformed into the Central Intelligence Agency, and that the Truman Doctrine and the Voice of America became the first acts of ontological aggression in the Cold War. To put this moment in context, just the previous December, so 6 months before, Kenneth Arnold, who was a fire extinguisher salesman and a private pilot, saw 9 flying somethings sort of undulating like tops, he said, like discs, he said, skimming on the water over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. Just 6 months before, the American Venona project, which was a project for monitoring Soviet intelligence transmissions, had discovered to its horror that there were Soviet moles inside the Manhattan Project within several government bodies, including the former CIA, within the Army, Air Force, soon to be the Air Force, within the War Production Board, the Treasury, the State Department, and even within the White House administrators. So this was a really tense, very, very tense moment in the early days of the Cold War. And really, Arnold's mistake unwitting mistake was to say that he thought what he saw were probably American or Soviet secret aircraft, probably he felt using atomic engines. What he didn't realize was that the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission were actually working on atomic engines for aircraft. So this got him in all sorts of trouble, which I go into in the book. I can't go into here, but involved a strange wild goose chase being sent after crashed alien spacecraft parts, which also tragically resulted in the first 2 fatalities that the US Air Force ever suffered. 2 Air Force intelligence guys who went to pick up what was effectively a Kellogg's cornflakes box full of slate Coke that they wanted to transport back to their Air Force base, and their plane crashed. But anyway, so the idea for the first few years of the UFO story, I'm sorry, this is a Navy plane that from the late 40s that looks uncannily like what Arnold saw, but I don't think it is. It's just a great image. But so for the first wave, 4 or 5 years really of the UFO story, people really saw them as secret weapons, probably Soviet secret weapons, almost certainly, but they probably hoped that some of them were American as well. And that's exemplified by this, the first flying saucer movie, The Flying Saucer, starring, produced, directed, and I think written by Mikhail Conrad. And in it, a sort of malevolent Soviet scientist in Alaska is flying this secret flying saucer craft to terrorize Americans. And that really sort of sums up the story at that time. And by 1950, for the first couple of years, the US press was so inundated with flying saucer stories, and these gradually spread into Europe. And this is actually, on the left, a news story from the Daily Mirror in 1950 that's talking about the first flying saucer sightings over Europe, and where an Italian scientist in this case is saying that these are nothing new and were developed by the Soviets during World War II, and this is just developed by the Germans in World War II, and then the technology was picked up by the Soviets, and this is what was being seen flying over Europe. And here's an illustration of what that might have been. The Flugskreisel flying top, allegedly developed by Rudolf Schreiber, who came forward around the same time at the top here. But this was a time of real great concern for the American Air Force, particularly that the flying saucer panic was really getting out of control, and they did everything they could from keeping a lid on them, including banning their own pilots from talking about them, and that was a joint American-Canadian sort of order, and you can see that order here, and the reason being they didn't want to generate fear and sort of panic within the military, which would then flood out to the rest of the population. And that was a very serious order, very serious kind of crime to talk about flying saucers if you were within the Air Force, with a up to a 10-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine. That was a lot of money in those days. And so it became clear that the UFO flying saucer story was a serious intelligence and security problem, and one that needed to be contained, but they just couldn't keep a lid on it. And this is an example of sort of what was emerging around this time. These are both from 1950. The one on the left, flying saucers are real, by Major Donald Kehoe, who was a Navy man, and the one on the right was from Variety magazine's key gossip columnist, who ended up writing a sensational UFO book. That's another long story, but it's interesting that some of the early pro-extraterrestrial writing in mainstream magazines like True, which was the loaded or nuts of its time, which was the biggest men's magazine at the time, was actually by Navy men, and at the time the Air Force and the Navy were locked in an incredible battle that some described as a civil war over who would get military funding after World War II. So something had to change, and I think this is a kind of key moment. Is a paper prepared for RAND, which was the Air Force's research and development kind of corporation, and published in 1950, and it's called The Exploitation of Superstitions for Psychological Warfare. And it was really a kind of catalogue of strategies used during the first two world wars for exploiting popular beliefs to sort of gain the military advantage. It notes that superstitions flourish in an atmosphere of tension and insecurity, and wonders what evidence is there that some types of superstitions lose their credibility after enjoying a brief vogue. And this was the problem. They had to find ways to kind of maintain, extend the natural lifetime of superstitions. Questions, it also asks, what types of superstitious appeals will be best adapted to the various audiences to be propagandized, and suggests that a study of local superstitions, as reflected in popular folklore, might be profitable in providing answers to these questions. And it gives various examples of from the wars of employing fake astrologers to spread bad predictions, projecting images onto clouds over the trenches. In a great story, Neville Maskelyne, who was a popular stage magician, talks about how he built a kind of sort of walking demonic kind of scarecrow construction that they used to terrify villagers in the Italian mountains, and so drive them out of their towns while thinking that the devil was working for the British, and apparently this worked. And there's a lot more about this, but I can't go into it. At the same time, 1951, we have The Day the Earth Stood Still, still a magnificent science fiction film, which kind of suggested that our benevolent visitors would actually be very much like the Americans. They'd be essentially Christian and would be in a suitable role to be moral arbiters of global politics and society, and also wield ultimate destruction in the form of the atom bomb. In this, they have a sort of ray, but obviously the Americans saw themselves as wielding this authority with the atom bomb. And as the flying saucer story just escalated out of control, I think, and partly to do with, I suspect, this paper prepared by Rand, which I should point out discusses absolutely everything, every superstitious and folkloric belief under the sun except flying saucers, at a time when flying saucers were the Air Force's primary concern. By 1952, in April, the Air Force is clearly changing its tack, and in a carefully managed article whereby they invited two life journalists to spend a lot of time with the Air Force and discuss flying saucers, they present on in an issue with Marilyn Monroe on the cover. There is a case for interplanetary sources, and they try to basically turn the story around and say, okay, the flying saucers might actually be from elsewhere, but we shouldn't worry about it too much. That same year, there was an incredible escalation in flying saucer reports across America and in the press. I mean, thousands and tens of thousands of reports. And that July, in a complex story, again, I can't really get into, there were two alleged sort of flyovers of Washington, D.C. by objects, UFOs, real UFOs, that seemed to only appear on radar, couldn't be pursued by pilots, and the story was a sort of uncanny echo of what had been seen in the dailies as still the previous year. Really, I think this served all sorts of purposes. One purpose was that it was considered enough of a story and enough of an issue that the CIA decided to get involved with the flying saucer business. I'll come to that in a second. So over the next couple of years, from 1952 onwards, there was a sort of significant shift in the way people thought about flying saucers, and it moved from a political and sort of mechanical issue of were they American or Soviet secret technologies, to something that was becoming more of a spiritual or religious issue, and that's what I see it as now for most of the people who are interested. And so you had characters like the man in the left-hand side of the top left picture, George Adamski, who met Orthon from Venus, sort of Aryan, beautiful, blonde, long-haired, angelic figure in the desert, in the Mojave Desert, who told him that they shouldn't use the atom bomb, and these are his own photographs of the flying saucers. And really, the sort of flying saucers began to kind of colonize the imagination in a really sort of just a sort of in a deep way. I think this, I don't know, but I suspect, following the sort of apocalyptic horrors of World War II, there was a sense that God had sort of in some way abandoned humankind and left us to our own vicious devices. And perhaps for many people, the angelic extraterrestrials were in some way a kind of technological angels who could sort of steer us in the same way that the old God or gods had, and in which technology replaced morality in this new religion, and there could be no higher power than the atom bomb. I'm going to have to zoom through this. So by the mid-1950s, the CIA takes a keen interest in the UFO story, and decides that the subject was really a problem for America, and they were afraid of the communications channels being clogged with irrelevant reports, creating a cry wolf situation that would generate so many false alarms of aerial intrusions that genuine hostile actions might be ignored. They also stated that the subject threatened to inculcate a morbid national psychology in which hostile propaganda could induce hysterical behavior and harmful distrust of duly constituted authority. So the fear was that flying saucers could make a rebel out of you, or even worse, a communist. So they, realizing that the Soviets could use the flying saucer story in this way, they decided, I think, to sort of turn it around and use it themselves. And one of their great concerns actually was that there were despite the US press being absolutely flooded with UFO and flying saucer stories, the Soviet press contained nothing at all, and they really, this terrified them, and I suspect they were also sort of jealous as well. So what they started doing was actually, as we've seen in the Air Force, separating the UFO story into the sort of technological aspect, which was increasingly fading, and increasing the sort of enigmatic aspect. And they were able to do things like convince people who'd seen U-2 overflights that, actually it's quite complicated. People would report to the Air Force that they'd seen a UFO. The Air Force would check against their records to see whether the U-2 was flying over that time. And if it was, then they would have to convince Mr. and Mrs. Johnson that they hadn't seen a UFO, they'd seen the planet Venus, even though in fact they'd probably seen the U-2, and they sort of were playing this sort of complex, multi-layered bluff. That really sets the scene. I wanted to go into the sort of spread of the UFO story into Europe and sort of how that tied in with the Soviet story. I mean, one key moment comes in 1955 when this man, Senator Richard Russell, head of the US Armed Services Committee and one of the most knowledgeable experts on defense matters in the US, has a very, very clear and striking flying saucer sighting in Azerbaijan while as a guest of the Soviets. And he was on a train with a CIA officer and another man, and they saw two, what they described as perfect flying discs, coming over their train and then looping back down and landing again, and in what sounds quite possibly like a sort of staged demonstration. And even though he knew the official line was that there were no flying saucers, he was absolutely adamant that he'd seen these things, as was his CIA colleague. What he actually didn't know, although I suspect someone in the Air Force would have done by this time, was that the Air Force was now working with Avro aircraft manufacturers in Canada to make their own flying saucers, which were being developed by this man, John Frost, who was a British aircraft designer who'd worked for de Havilland in the past. They tried very hard to get. Sorry, I should explain what that is. The flying saucer sort of idea works using a sort of airstream model developed by a Romanian inventor in the 30s called Henri Coanda, and it's what you see when you put the curve of a spoon underwater and you see the way the water flows over the top of it. The same with air, and that's actually what's deployed in the Dyson Airstream fan that we see here, which I've never tried one, but they look great. So this is actually pre-flight. This is the thing they were trying to develop before the flying saucer. These are very early, small models of what the flying saucers, the American flying saucers, would look like. But we don't know to what extent these did get developed. Certainly, the last sort of discussion of them is of flight tests and wind tests in 1957, and then the story ends, and who knows what happened. This was a later attempt to build a miniature missile drone saucer, and the story really continues through the development of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, that are now kind of key part of modern warfare that we hear so much about. Also things like this, the silent helicopter developed in 1970 and flown in Vietnam, and again disappears off the map once it returns to Edwards Air Force Base in California. This has only been made public 3 years ago now, and it was one of the kind of touchstones of the conspiracy crowd that the government was flying these silent helicopters over their heads, and actually they had developed the technology, even though they certainly hadn't used it in the public sphere. But it worked very well. People who stood underneath it at air bases described seeing it over your head and hearing a distant whine as of a aircraft in the distance. So very, very quickly, can I just do very, very quick bit here? What I wanted to talk about was this great case from 1976, where the Iranian Air Force chased a UFO over Tehran. And this is a sort of great model of the way the disinformation worked. This was, I would suggest, part of a program of very, very illicit unmanned aircraft flights into the Soviet Union from Iran, and then the Air Force unwittingly chased these things, and a kind of disinformation program was put in place. So it was reported in the Tehran Journal. I'll skip that. Then enters the sort of the story is leaked. The internal Air Force reports are leaked to UFO journals in the US. and then make it into the National Enquirer the following year. And then it's now also considered one of the great sort of UFO stories. It's interesting that the most detailed account of that incident is described in the Air Force's Internal Electronic Warfare Center journal in the period. Anyway, haven't really got time to go into Area 51, but I thought it was interesting to note that Russian MiGs were the actual real alien technology being experimented with and explored at Area 51 in the 60s, and that's sort of that's the kind of alien technology we're talking about. That's stealth fighter. This is I can't go into this. This is just very briefly, so we're talking about landscape and architecture. In the early 1980s, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, headed at the instigation of the Air Force's Special Programs Unit, who were protecting the newly emerging stealth fighter, basically conducted an incredible disinformation campaign where they used these two guys on the right from the UFO community to spread information that ultimately suggested that a piece of Indian land in New Mexico was actually the site of an extraterrestrial underground base, and they kind of, fantastic sleight of hand, got all the UFO investigators to stop taking an interest in Area 51, and that's actually the first ever talk of Area 51 in the context of extraterrestrials in a UFO magazine from 1981. They moved all their attentions hundreds of miles away to this small Indian reservation in New Mexico, which interestingly had an irradiated water supply thanks to the use of atomic bombs to try and release natural gases from there in the 60s. They also developed faked internal documents, government documents, talking about the UFO cover-up, and these are all the stories that have now sort of fed into the wider popular kind of lore surrounding UFOs. And the story never ends. This is from 2 years ago, stories from the Iran press of UFOs being shot down there. And this is, I think, really the attitude you find if you try to discuss this stuff with any of these people, except with one or two exceptions, and indeed in the sort of wider culture. So thanks very much. Sorry for the.
Thanks, Mark. So what we are going to do, there's a kind of a scheduling quirk has us changing rooms at this point. We're going to take a break. We're going to go downstairs to the dining room. We're going to have cake and coffee. And the idea is, just in keeping with the mode and form of the studio, is that rather than doing kind of a formal question and answer session here, the idea is to do that downstairs over coffee and cakes, and so it's much more informal and much more of a conversation. And what we're going to do then, we're going to do that for the next half an hour, between 4:30 and 5, and then we're going to reconvene. We're in another part of the school. We have another space with seating and with screens and everything, and we're going to finish the rest of the following session of the day, which is particularly with Louise K. Wilson, who's a fantastic sound artist, has been working a lot with the space industry, and she's also going to be doing an acoustic technologies microphone workshop.
Yeah. So do bear with us. We'll cut if you go down to the cafeteria,
the
dining hall, have some coffee. We'll change rooms, sort it out, and we'll come and get you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.